All right, good Shabbos. Hopefully we are stable now and fly away. All right, so this week's parasha is once again a double parasha, double whammy. We've got two parashas in one, just like we did last week. And the first half of our parasha is called Parashat Acharei-Mot. And that, of course, means after the death of Aaron's two sons. But majority of the first parasha discusses the laws of Yom Kippur. And it makes for fun reading, doesn't it? And that is the first parasha. The second parasha we studied today is called Kedoshim. Kedoshim, of course, means holiness. But that parasha is jam-packed with commandments about everyday things that we do. In fact, there's over 50 commandments just in that parasha. And together with both parashas, there are over 70 commandments. So it's one of the most the most commandment-packed parashas that we have, if not the most packed parasha that we have. Now, I want you guys to do a little experiment with me. Take a trip down memory lane. Think back a few months back to last year, September, October, when we had Yom Kippur and we had the service here outside. Remember how we came here all dressed in our white clothes, with our pluckies or our socks or barefoot? We all came with different shoes. And we looked like some weird sect. I don't know if you've seen those guys next to the road on the highway or anywhere where you drive. They always dress in white every Sunday. I think it's a Zimbabwean sect. We looked like that, right? And we stood here outside, and it was nice to be able to have services, right? Even though it was a limited service, because back then we still had a time cap on our services as well. We had fewer people were allowed to come, but Baruch Hashem, we were allowed to actually come here. And it was very different because of the rules that we had, right? We had that long break in the middle of the day, which I think was actually a bad thing, because all we did was go home and get more hungry. Usually when we're here all day praying on Yom Kippur, we can at least keep ourselves busy the whole day long and take our minds off of our stomachs. And some people even told me, I think it was Brian was telling me, that the longer the service went on, the more the Siddur felt like a weight or a heavy brick as you were standing here without tables in front of you. But it was also nice. It was special to have that Yom Kippur service here outside. We could watch at the afternoon, at the end of the day, when we did our Mincha service and our Ne'ilah service, we could watch the sun set as our prayers were going up to Hashem. In the very last moments, as the gates of heaven were closing, we could watch the sun going down, and we could have that extra impetus into our Yom Kippur prayers this year, which I don't think we've ever had before in previous years. Now, one of the highlights of the Yom Kippur service that we do every year and during the prayers is the reciting of the temple service that the priest would do on this day of Yom Kippur. Because Yom Kippur, of course, is the Holy of Holies of days. It's the only day of the year that the high priest would enter into the Holy of Holies in the temple. That one day a year. The Holy of Holies is the connecting point between heaven and earth. It's where what's above meets what's here below in this reality on this earth. It's very similar to Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai had the same thing going for it. And if you think about it, Moses, when he went up Mount Sinai, it was also covered in smoke and darkness. The same as with Aaron. In this week's parasha, we read about when he enters the Holy of Holies, he has to start this smoke machine, and there's no light in the Holy of Holies. The menorah is outside in the other part of the tabernacle, right? So it's exactly the same. It's also got smoke and darkness. And just like Mount Sinai was the connecting point between heaven and earth, and Moses brought the Torah from us from heaven down to earth, so too once a year Aaron goes into the Holy of Holies, the connecting point between heaven and earth, and brings for us atonement from the other side, if I can say that. From above, he brings atonement to us here below. And there's something very interesting that happens during the service on that one day a year when Aaron is allowed to enter the Holy of Holies that I want to talk about today. That is the sprinkling of the blood. So how many times, what Aaron does is he takes the blood of the bull that he sacrificed for himself, and then later on he takes the blood of the goat that he sacrificed to Israel, and he brings that blood in the cup, he brings it into the Holy of Holies, and he's commanded to sprinkle the blood. Who can tell me how many times is he supposed to sprinkle it? What does the Torah tell us? Anyone want to guess? 7. Any other guesses? Or are we sticking with the 7? You can't raise all your fingers and hope you're right, Neil. Neil is casting lots. See which one is right. Okay, so the general agreed idea is 7, right? And it makes sense because that's what the text tells us. It actually gives us the number 7 in the text of this week's parasha. But when we recite the sprinkling every year here on Yom Kippur, when we read it out of that mahzor, who can remember how we say it? How do we count? How does the high priest count when he sprinkles? 1, 1 and 1, 1 and 2, 1 and 3, 1 and 4, 1 and 5, 1 and 6, 1 and 7. So what is 1 and 7? It's 8, basic math, right? He actually sprinkles 8 times. Now, the reason why he sprinkles 8 times is because if you read the text closely as the rabbis do, because they didn't have TV back in the day, so they got a lot more time on their hands. The verse actually tells us, you shall take the blood of the bull and you shall sprinkle it upon the ark cover towards the east and in front of the ark 7 times. Okay, so that's the explanation of how we get down to that. And the Talmud goes deep into this and elaborates how this is done. Because they actually point out that in the first half of the verse where it says, you shall sprinkle it upon the ark cover towards the east, the way that Hebrew word should be understood is that the sprinkling must be done upwards. So it explains in the Talmud that the priest must actually put his hand in a way so that when he sprinkles with that index finger, when he takes it from the bowl and he sprinkles it, it must go upwards for that first sprinkle. But then the next part of the verse where it says you shall sprinkle it before the Ark of the Covenant 7 times, means obviously it's going to be on the floor before the Ark. So then he must move his hand the other way around so that when he sprinkles it, it's going down 7 times. And that is why we have this counting. That's why we have this funny counting. Actually, it's not actually us that's supposed to do it. It's the priest that does it, right? He's the one that says 1, 1 and 1, 1 and 2, 1 and 3, all the way to 1 and 7. So that he doesn't make the mistake in sprinkling the wrong amount of time. I don't know how many of you ever get confused when you have to count and do stuff, but I've noticed that at almost every Jewish wedding that I've went to, you know, you're supposed to circle the bride 7 times. Everyone loses count and everyone's on a different number. So you just, let them do whatever their wedding, let them figure it out. But the priest had this problem because he has to fulfill both commandments, which is once up and 7 times downward. So he does this funny little counting thing. And it's very similar to how we count the Omer today. We do the same thing in the counting of the Omer, right? So last night we counted 27 days, I think it was. Correct? Yeah, 27. But the way that we count the Omer is a bit of an argument among the sages because they asked the question, do we count the days of the Omer or do we count the weeks of the Omer? And eventually they decided, okay, let's just make peace in order to keep everyone happy. We'll do all the halacha. We'll count both the days and the week. That's why we say today was 27 days, and then we count the weeks, which is 3 weeks and 6 days of the Omer. Okay, so to keep them happy. So that's pretty much the same thing going on here. But when it comes to the discussion about the high priest and when he did the sprinklings, there's also a discussion. Should we first count the upward one or should we first count the 7 downwards one? And there's an argument, and they eventually come to say both are acceptable, but the one that we follow, the halakha that we follow, is that you must count the upwards one first. That's why we say 1 and 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc., etc., etc. And there is a lesson that we can learn from this. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch points out to us that the lesson that we should learn from this is that one should always look up first. Before you worry about what's happening here on earth, realize that you must always be connected to what is above before you do what you do here below on earth. Everything we do down on earth must be done l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven above. Catch that. Everything we do down here on earth 7 times must be done for the sake of heaven above. Because the number 7, what does that represent? It's the creation. 7 days of creation. It is this world, this reality. Everything in our nature relies upon the number 7. 7 is our number for functioning in this world. But the number 8, what does the number 8 represent? Something beyond this world, right? The 8th day on Sukkot, we talk about that as well. The 8th day, which by the way we do as well on Pesach here outside of Israel, we always talk about the meal of Messiah and we plan for the future, the world to come, and the times that we know nothing about, something outside of this reality. So what's above that one sprinkle he does up is the great vision of what God wants for this world. But what's below the 7 sprinkles is where we actually take that vision that God has and we put that vision to action. And we can learn this from the second parasha of this week, Parashat Kedoshim. Because in Parashat Kedoshim, we get the laws of holiness. But what you think is holy and what the Torah defines as holy usually is not the same thing. Because what are the laws of holiness in the parasha this week? Simple, earthly, fleshly things. The greatest commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. It's all about me and you and my neighbor and my fellow. It's about us. It's fleshly things. It's the 7 of us, if you can put it that way. Right? Other commandments we find in this week's parasha. Do not do all these horrible things the Canaanites did, because the land will vomit you out as well. The stuff the Canaanites did, if you read through the parasha, the most fleshly things you'll find in the entire Torah. Right? What about that other commandment that says you must pay your laborer on the right day? You can't let it wait till morning because the poor guy wants his money so he can buy a puff and place. It's earthly, everyday, practical things that define holiness according to the Torah. But these simple, everyday, downward, earthly things, these mitzvot, when you read them in the parasha, they come with a clause. At the end of every major section in that parasha, God says at the end of every commandment, I am the Lord your God. And that should teach us the same concept as the 1 up and the 7 down. Sorry to use a cricketing term, 1 up. But the 1 up and the 7 down is that when you do the 7 down things, the earthly, the physical, normal commandments like loving your fellow, paying him on the right day, etc., your focus should be above, on something greater. Every deed you do shouldn't be done just for the sake of doing a deed. It should be done as an act of godliness. But keep in mind, when you do one of God's commandments, don't try and take credit for it. Don't take credit for it. We learned this in the Pirkei Avot last week in chapter 2. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai tells us, if you have learned and studied much Torah, take no credit for it, because this is the purpose of why you were created. It's like a kettle trying to boast that he boiled the water. That's your job, is to do God's commandments. You can't boast about doing God's commandments. And we have to understand, when it comes to holiness and the commandments read in this week's parasha, when we act them out, why are we acting out these commandments? Why do we keep God's commandments? Is it simply because everyone around you is doing it as well and it's the in thing? Is it because your wife told you so, your mom, your dad told you so? That is just what we call ceremonial holiness. And there's a difference between ceremonial holiness and godly holiness. Because God also commands us in the parasha what type of holiness we should be living out. He says, be holy as I am holy. Is there a wrong way to be holy? This is a weird question. What do you think? Yeah. Any examples? I guess I am holy. Swiss cheese holy. For example, the holiest man in the world is who? Well, in the temple standing at least. The Kohen Gadol, the high priest, he's the holiest man in the world, right? He's like the holy of holies of human beings. But that doesn't mean that he is a godly, holy person. For example, in Yeshua's day, who was the high priest? We had old Caiaphas and some other fishes in his family as well. His father-in-law, Ananias, he was also another fish. And they were all corrupt, disgusting human beings. Yet, they were the holiest person on the earth at that stage. So we need to learn from this that there's a certain way that we should act and be holy when we keep God's commandments. Our job is to imbue the earthly, the downwardly things here below, with the heavenly and the godly, the things from above, on a daily basis. So how do we make sure that we don't fall into that trap of just doing the commandments because Sydney said so at shul, or because this and this and this? Just do it because it's everyone's doing it, we're going with the flow. How do we ensure that when we keep the commandments, because I'm sure you all do, look at you righteous individuals, I'm sure you keep all 613 of them. How do you ensure that when you keep those 613 commandments, you're doing them right, with the intent of godliness, always thinking about 1 up before you do the 7 down? Yeshua gives us a life hack. He tells us every morning when you wake up, here is a prayer you can use that communicates this very idea, the Lord's Prayer. And what do we say in the Lord's Prayer? Our Father, who is up there above in heaven, hallowed be your name. Yiskadesh Shmecho. We use the word kadosh. We're defining what type of holiness we're aiming towards. Godly holiness, not normal ceremonial holiness, just for the sake of being set apart. You can be crazy and off your head and you'll be set apart technically, right? Even sequestered, hopefully, right? But we've got to be holy, set apart. So our Father who is up above in heaven, hallowed be your name. Holy, set apart be your name. Thy kingdom up there, come down here. Thy will up there be done down here on earth as it is in heaven. So our job then is to do the mitzvot, not just because, but to do these mitzvot for holiness in the sense of connecting our heart, our soul, our mind to every mitzvah we do. And when we remind ourselves of that while we keep these commandments, which you guys obviously all do, what we're doing then is we're going to bring the heaven into the seven. We're going to bring the above to the down below. We, just like the Holy of Holies, become the connecting point between heaven and earth. Shabbat Shalom.
Hey, Shabbat Shalom.